All right. Hi. Okay. I would like to thank all those that are checking out our second week of Deeper Than Dogma here, our little discussion panel on our little corner of the interwebs here. Tonight we're going to be discussing presuppositions, or not, or maybe, I don't know. One of the topics that I've heard quite often in recent hangouts was this idea that we hold concepts, or that some people hold concepts like naturalism as a presupposition. Well, someone like me will see it as a conclusion based on the evidence that we have. On the panel tonight, we have myself and Xbox, Ozymandias Ramses, Seamus, Negation of P, Epicurus A. Greece, and our returning champion, Floyd. With the topic tonight, it was one of the ideas came from Floyd FP here, so I'm going to toss off to him first to kind of lay out why he wanted to bring this topic up.
Yeah, it's something that that's come up in the last few weeks in general discussions and hangouts, and it's an argument that I've heard before, but I haven't heard it in a while. But it seemed to have come back where Calvinists and presuppositionalists will openly admit that the belief in the existence of their God and that Scripture is the inspired word of an inerrant word of the God is a presupposition, and they start from there, and from those presuppositions they have a theory of knowledge, and they can find their experience intelligible and so forth. So they start from there, and what they also do is accuse non-believers of starting with naturalism or physicalism, that we actually start there, and then we derive other beliefs from naturalism, whether it be metaphysical naturalism or methodological naturalism. And my contention is that's simply not true. I admit from the get-go that I have presuppositions. That everyone has presuppositions, like they point out, but naturalism or physicalism is not one of them. Naturalism or physicalism is something that seems to be more of a conclusion to me than actually a starting point, a presupposition. I don't hold naturalism or physicalism dogmatically. As far as I know, there could be a supernatural realm or a super duper natural realm or a super duper duper natural realm with a cherry on top that I'm not aware of. But I don't rule that out, but I don't have anything to warrant such a belief at this time. But again, to get back, do I start out with naturalism or physicalism being the case? No, I don't think so. And it seems like some theists are forcing us to either accept supernaturalism or naturalism, one or the other, and we can only do so via presupposition, and that's what I think is incorrect. And also, I guess from that, I heard say that the way some Christians define their God, there can be no such thing as agnosticism. If you define the God of Christianity as the God that everyone knows, then you cannot be agnostic, because if you're agnostic, you would claim not to know such a God. So if you claim not to know such a God, then such a God could not exist, because the God is defined as a God that everyone knows. So they're kind of they seem to be forcing a dichotomy there. Either you accept this God or you don't, and there's no middle ground at all. And it almost sounds like it's kind of like it's the new. I consider it could be a new ontological argument. Instead of the God which is maximally great, it's now the God that everyone knows, and for this God to be known, he has to be necessary. Ergo, this God exists. So it's like a brand new ontological argument. I guess, Ozzy, could you talk about whether that makes sense, that you can't be agnostic about such a God?
Uh, Sure. You want me to address the issue about agnosticism specifically, or naturalism as well?
Or I guess either. I guess perhaps you can start with naturalism, I guess.
Okay. Well, with respect to naturalism, I mean, I would describe myself as a provisional naturalist, um, uh, but I certainly don't presuppose naturalism, um, and I think it's a mistake. I mean, I'll disagree with you on one point, Floyd. I don't know exactly your mind on this, but I know that an awful lot of atheists do, in fact, presuppose naturalism. In fact, one of the arguments that I hear from atheists, and I've never heard you make this argument, but one argument that I hear some atheists make all the time is that God can't exist because God's supernatural, and everything that exists is natural, and whatever we were to discover, whatever we might happen to discover in future, it would just be more natural, right? It would just be more of the natural. It would just have to be subsumed under the heading of natural. And I know you don't do this, Floyd, but a lot of atheists do this. And when they do, when people do that, they are in fact presupposing naturalism. That is, they are literally begging the question against the person who's putting forth the idea that there are supernatural causes and forces and principles and that sort of thing. So if you're having a discussion with someone, if you are a naturalist and you're having a discussion with someone who is a supernaturalist, who believes in the supernatural, the one thing you must not do is say that, by definition, everything in existence is natural, and by definition, anything that we would discover would have to fall under the heading of natural, right? That's going to be a very hard burden of justification to discharge, right? And so that is a mistake that some people make, but it doesn't follow from the fact that a lot of atheists make this mistake that if you're an atheist, you're necessarily a naturalist, and if you don't believe in a God, that you have to be a naturalist. I mean, I've known all kinds of atheists, first of all, who weren't naturalists, who believed in all kinds of supernatural things, ghosts and an afterlife and principles of karma and stuff like that. They didn't believe in a God, but they believed in all manner of supernatural things and paranormal things and that sort of stuff. So just because a person doesn't believe in a God doesn't mean that they hold supernaturalism as sort of out of court and off the table. But to believe in naturalism, that is to think that everything in reality is natural, can be a conclusion. It doesn't have to be a presupposition. You can have arrived at the conclusion, and provided you hold it provisionally, I think, and don't assume that everything has to be natural by definition, then it's not a presupposition, right? As long as you're willing to admit that in principle something could come along that's so wildly different in its characteristics that we would not be inclined to subsume it under the heading of natural, that it would belong under a different ontological category, well, then you're not presupposing naturalism. And that would be my view. Like, people have asked me, what would it take for you to, believe that God exists, Yahweh, right? And the examples I've always given are, well, for instance, I mean, here's something that God could do, that Yahweh could do, that would certainly suffice, okay? Not that a God would be obligated to do this, but if this happened, it would convince me. So imagine that Yahweh appears, he materializes, and he's 1,000 feet tall, and he says, "I am Yahweh, I am that I am the God of Abraham, and I created the universe, and I am appearing to you in this form so that you can see me." And he demonstrates his supernatural powers and control over nature in extraordinary ways. He moves the stars around in the sky so they spell out, "I am that I am Yahweh," something like that, in every possible language, right? So that everybody in the world, no matter what language they speak, they look up at the night sky and they can see, the name of Yahweh in the stars. And astronomers could confirm that, hey, the stars actually moved. It's not an illusion. The stars actually moved, right? He could also do something like deliver a private communion-like experience to everybody on Earth simultaneously, so that everyone would say, "Oh my goodness, I had the most extraordinary experience," and they would relate their experience to the person next to them, and the person next to them would say, "Yeah, I had it too." Everyone would know that they themselves had that same experience, so that it wouldn't matter if they thought someone else was lying. They themselves would know it, that it had happened. And people who were asleep could wake up and say, "I had the most extraordinary dream," and they could relate their dream, and it would be the same experience as everyone who was awake. right? I mean, that would be utterly convincing, right? He could stamp "made by Yahweh" on every particle in the universe, so that you look down at your electron microscope and you see "made by Yahweh" stamped on every particle. I mean, these are the sorts of things that, if they happened, we would never be inclined to say, "Oh, this is just another natural phenomenon," right? I mean, if you're the kind of person who said, "If that happened, I would be inclined to think that this didn't count as evidence for the existence of Yahweh, the creator of the universe. I would insist that this was powerful alien technology." Then I would say you're a dogmatist. Then I would say you've got a problem. You'll cast about for any other interpretation than the one that recommends itself to you. You're looking for a natural explanation where a supernatural explanation would recommend itself. And this phenomena, or these phenomena that I just described, if they all happened, we would not be inclined to think they were natural. That we would suddenly, I think, almost all of us be prepared to say, you know what? There is a new class of phenomena here that is so different from natural phenomena, it belongs under its own heading. And there, suddenly, the supernatural would stand revealed as a fact.
Where do I say I don't know at that point? Like I don't know what caused these. I don't know what stamp. I know the stamp is there on every particle, but I have no idea how it got there.
Well, you wouldn't have to know the mechanism of how it got there, right? You'd have every reason to think that it was attributable to this being that had materialized 1,000 feet tall and took credit for moving the stars, and was taking credit for delivering this private, incommunicable experience to every person on Earth simultaneously, right? You would have every reason to think, if that were to happen, that this being was the cause. You have no reason to suspect anything else. It's not that you couldn't imagine another explanation. It's that this would be the best explanation. This would be an inference to the best explanation, and it would be perverse and absolutely dogmatic to say, well, that's probably not the explanation.
Yes, yeah, I wouldn't go that far and say. I would just be curious, I guess, about, or agnostic, more or less, of it happening. I see how you're saying it would be the reasonable thing to infer from it.
Well, I just want to say one thing about knowledge. It has nothing to do with knowledge. It's would this be a warranted belief or not, that Yahweh had in fact appeared and he did exist and he did create the universe, and here he was demonstrating his control and majesty over all of material reality. This would, this would in fact be fantastic evidence for such a being, right? What better evidence could you think of? I can't think of better evidence than that. That would be fantastic.
That's a great point.
It's not necessary that, see, in order to know something, okay, to have a well-warranted belief that something is the case, it doesn't have to be the case that every other possibility is ruled out of possibility, so there couldn't be another explanation, right? Right? In science we say that we know this, we know that, we know all these things via science, but it doesn't mean that we've ruled out every other logical possibility, so that this is the only remaining possibility. It's that every other possibility just seems thin and far-fetched compared to the well-established findings of science.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Well, I'd like to throw it back to Floyd for rebuttal and negation of P if you want to add anything in there. Before I guess to the theists.
Well, when I was listening to you, Ozzy, it seems like you're bringing up, almost seems like empiricism, that you would believe in God if your senses or whatever received information that this God exists. But what do you think the idea that presuppositionists have, that the truth of the existence of this God is simply a transcendental truth, that it's simply a presupposition, and then to claim otherwise, you have to presuppose it as well. That so it doesn't matter what what evidence or what later knowledge, what experience you have of this God. It doesn't matter if we simply declare this God as necessary transcendental being. There's nothing in your experience can deny that, and you can only presuppose the opposite of it. Well,
I don't think that the choices are so stark and binary that you have to You either have to presuppose it as necessary or else you're denying it. I mean, that is a false dichotomy. I mean, just because one says that I'm positing X and I posit that X has the attribute of being necessary, that is existing by necessity, it doesn't follow that if you say, well, I'm not convinced of that, that you are thereby denying that. You're not thereby asserting the opposite, that such a being does not exist, right? There's a mistake that people make all the time, and actually this is a mistake that atheists often make. You often hear atheists say, look, there's either a God or there's no God, right? There's no two ways about it. This is an excluded middle, right? Either God exists or doesn't exist. Therefore, you either have to be a theist or an atheist, they will say. You can't be an agnostic. Now, this is in fact a fallacy. This is confusing what's known as intentionality with extensionality. Extensionally speaking, that is, existentially and ontologically speaking, God either exists or doesn't exist. But it doesn't follow that every belief state, every doxastic state that you can have about those existential or ontological states have to be binary, right? Consider the case that if I say, Floyd, do I have a quarter in my pocket, right? And you don't know. You'll presumably say, well, gee, Ozzy, I don't know if you have a quarter in your pocket. Now, supposing I said, no, look, there's either a quarter in my pocket or there isn't a quarter in my pocket. Make up your damn mind, Floyd. Which is it? Are you a quarterist or are you an a-quarterist? Do you believe that there's a quarter or do you believe that there's no quarter, right? No, you can say, listen, Ozzy, you're trying to force me to one conclusion over another just because there's only two possible states of affairs here. Either there's a quarter or there isn't. But in fact, I don't know if there's a quarter, and so I'm not prepared to assert that there's a quarter, and I'm not prepared to assert that there's no quarter. I'm prepared to assert neither proposition, nor am I denying either proposition. I'm in a complete state of agnosticism. And you can do the same thing with God, and it doesn't matter if you slap the attribute of necessity onto this hypothetical entity, X, okay? It doesn't follow that because you are unpersuaded that X exists, whether or not it has the attribute of necessity, it doesn't follow from that because you're unconvinced that you are therefore asserting the opposite and denying the existence of that entity. You can in fact be an agnostic with respect to that position. Now, I'm an atheist, so in fact I would deny that proposition, but an agnostic doesn't, and so it simply does not follow that if a person says, I'm not persuaded that X exists, and further that X has the property of necessarily existing, it does not follow from that you're presupposing the opposite. You don't have to presuppose either one of those. You really can be have an indeterminate posture with respect to this. Your doxastic state can be such that you neither assert one nor the other, you neither deny one nor the other. That is in fact very common, so that's the whole point of the sort of the quarter in my pocket example. But a lot of people will try to force you into choosing either asserting P or asserting not P, simply because it is the case that either P is true or not P is true. But the fact that it's either P or not P that is the case, it does not follow that your belief states have to be limited to only those two possibilities. That is a fallacy. That's confusing intentionality, that's intentionality with an S, with extensionality.
Right. So it's not for the agnostic. If God is the necessary precondition for knowledge, experience, for everything, which the Christian asserts, the agnostic is not denying that. The agnostic isn't necessarily saying that this God doesn't have to be a necessary precondition. I think the agnostic is simply saying, he could be a necessary precondition, but I don't know. Maybe there are other factors, other beings, or other forces that could be the precondition of knowledge and experience and so forth. But right. Maybe not. Maybe this God is necessary. I simply don't know. So I don't think it's a dichotomy.
Yeah, there's a mistake that people make here. If I could just make one further point, people can get confused about necessity. They think that if you're saying that something is necessary, that you're denying that it's a possibility, and so that if you're asserting that God is possible, that you're saying God is merely possible, and that therefore God can't be necessary. Because if God is merely a possibility, then he isn't a necessity, right? But what people don't understand is a principle in modal logic that asserts that if something is necessarily the case, if P is necessarily the case, if necessarily P, it follows that possibly P. But it doesn't follow that merely possibly P, right? So if I say possibly P, okay, possibly some proposition P is true, okay, possibly P, that doesn't imply that necessarily P. But necessarily P implies possibly P. And but to say possibly P doesn't mean that something is a mere possibility, right? So if something is necessarily the case, it is at least minimally a possibility. It has to be a possibility before it's a necessity. So if something is a necessity, it is ex hypothesi also a possibility, right? In fact, to say that something is a necessity is to say that it is not just a possibility, it is a possibility at every possible world. It is an actuality at every possible world. That's what it means for something to be necessary in modal logic. And so when people say that God necessarily exists, what they're saying is God is an actualized possibility at every possible world, every conceivable, every imaginable world, and therefore he has to exist in this world too, and he has to exist in every world, and God therefore is necessary. But what happens is people say that God is necessary, and when you say, well, I don't know if God is necessary, maybe God is necessary, that is, possibly God is necessary, they think what you're saying is God isn't necessary. God is merely a possibility, but that's not true. That does not follow. What you're saying is possibly it is necessarily the case that God exists, but it is also possible that it is not necessarily the case that God exists. Again, you can be an agnostic about this, but most people don't know enough modal logic to realize that there's an equivocation here when people say maybe God exists or possibly God exists. I hope that's clear. I know it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the claim was made that, for you to even make that statement, God must exist. To have an experience, you made knowledge claims and so forth. So, I'm declaring that God is necessary for you to either utter that statement. But again, that could be possible. You're not denying it. That could be the precondition, but you don't simply know, right?
Right. Exactly right.
Now, I want to throw it to the theists here in a second. I just want to get negation of P in on this, throw in any that he wants at the start, and then promise we're going to start moving it back into that direction as well and open up the discussion to the rest of the floor.
Okay. Now, real quick, and I'm just going to springboard off of what Ozzy was talking about earlier. I think that one of the things that I see, at least from the atheist side on a lot of fronts, is that people won't go down the road that Ozzy was saying as far as what would convince you, and honestly approach that from the position of, the 1,000-foot tall deity and all of that. Because I think the problem is that if those things were to happen, and you still were to staunchly stand behind, I am an atheist, there must be some other driving force that's causing all of this, in my opinion, I would equate that to use Ozzy's example of the quarter again. Someone asks, is there a quarter in my pocket? And you say, I don't know, and they pull the quarter out and show it to you, and then they put it back in their pocket and ask you again. The most reasonable answer there would be, yes, there is a quarter in your pocket. I saw it. I have some type of discernible evidence that will drive me to make a probabilistic claim based on what I've seen. And to ignore that, to try to explain that away, I think we really get into the problem of becoming atheist on a dogmatic sense, to where nothing will sway us. So, and I thought I heard that a little bit, so I just wanted to touch on that and make sure that that was out there.
I get called a super skeptic all the time by Epi for that exact reason.
And speaking of which, Epi, do you have anything that you'd like to add from this, from the, maybe from a different perspective?
All right, so the topic at hand here is about, I'm guessing, presuppositionalism or something akin to that, just so I can get my straight before speaking my word on that.
On naturalism or physicalism, are those presuppositions, and are they?
Oh, okay. They can be, but they needn't be. So, for example, you could argue that one has to presuppose naturalism in order to come, like, just say here's an argument. One has to presuppose naturalism in order for the scientific method to be true. Or, so for example, or even in their everyday life, because every day we don't expect there to be miracles, we don't walk out and expect God to change the laws or something, even though he could just very well do that. I don't think that's a good argument, of course, but at the very same time, you could make that argument and argue for why we need to accept naturalism as a presupposition. But most of the time it needn't be. You could just, for example, accept naturalism provisionally, accept that, yeah, it's part of my worldview, and I think I've come to that because of thinking of all the evidence, the mere possibility of the supernatural, and the fact that I don't really need to take it up. Like, all these things could be very well non-presuppositional. So it can be, but it needn't be, would be my answer.
All right. Seamus, I think that you have a much different opinion on this, don't you?
Yeah, I do. All right, there's so much ground to cover, but I think the first thing to do is kind of say, I don't, when I usually say this as that naturalism, more specifically metaphysical naturalism, is a presupposition that most atheists hold. I don't want to say it's a presupposition that all atheists hold, because earlier there were brought up of, a naturalistic supernaturalist that they believe in like ghosts and spirits, but they hold to naturalism or some way. So I'm not going to say that every single atheist is under this category, but usually when I levy that against someone, it's usually in the context of someone I've talked to in a Google Hangout and I have experience with, I've had a dialogue with, I have a history with, and I have enough information in dialogue with them to assume that they absolutely do presuppose metaphysical naturalism. And, well, Ozzy has done a pretty good job of advocating that we need to sit on the fence here, guys. We have to. It has to be provisional. If it isn't provisional, Ozzy has already conceded that metaphysical naturalism is fallacious in its reasoning. It's definitely a worldview and it's definitely a precept. So he avoids this by saying, well, we need to come short of the absolute claim here, but we need to sit on the fence. We need to have this as a provisional. But the problem with that is and thank God for Jimmy showing up. But the problem for that is first of all, it's speculation. It's an assertion. We're provisionally holding to this. That they have no foundation for this claim. They can't show you where they hold an opposite thing to be true, right? They can't show you in one instance where, name one truth claim that you have evaluated that cannot be proven with methodological naturalism. It's not possible. They can't show you that example. Explain to me one thing that doesn't that you believe in that's the immaterial, that's not a concept or an abstract. And usually these same people, not all atheists, but the ones I talk to, cannot provide to me this defeater. So am I supposed to allow them to sit on the fence if they can't provide me an example to the contrary? Or is it rational for me to presuppose that they're just saying this because they want to come short of being fallacious when they actually do hold to this presupposition? And I think Ozzy recognized that. Well, let's think about this. We're talking here about a transcendental claim, right? This isn't a claim that can be evaluated through methodological naturalism or scientific method or testable, repeatable. It's not in that category. Okay, and a lot of times these people that I levy this claim to are people that say, prove God. You're making an assertion here, you need to prove this, and that they're asking me to prove it using a methodology of methodological naturalism, which is begging the question, which is Floyd's favorite state. They want me to prove a transcendental claim using a methodology that it can't be proven by, right? That begs the question. Well, then they say, because they know that's fallacious, they'll say, well, actually, I'm willing to accept something short of methodological naturalism. I'm willing to drop my standard down. Okay, then when you give them philosophical arguments or theological arguments or arguments that are not able to be proven through this standard, they reject them. And then they say, well, they maneuver around the fallacious of this by saying, well, I didn't reject it because of the scientific method, I just rejected it because of the base of its argument, right? But again, that's an assertion, that's speculation, and it has no grounding for their claim. Okay, so let's start with this. most people, they, let's see, I got some notes here. One thing I wanted to say about kind of why the Christian presuppositionalists levy this claim, and Floyd has pointed this out earlier. One of them is because the Christian Bible, which we presuppose to be true, and I have no shame in saying that, it says that all men know of God. And then if you say you don't know God, you're actually saying to the contrary, right? So that's one reason, but that's not the only reason. I think another reason is that, let me find this on my notes here. I think another reason, crap, give me a second.
Well, Seamus, you just want to talk about that point you made out?
Yeah, if you want to start the discussion now, I have a few other things.
If you define this God as a God as everyone knows, and I think, Ozzy, you pointed out earlier, it could be simply that it could be a God that one person knows. That wouldn't make a difference, right?
Sure. I just found my point in my notes. We also claim that the Christian presupposition claims he's the necessary precondition for existence, right, due to the impossibility of the contrary. So when you say that it's possible that there's a necessary precondition for existence that is not God, you're actually presupposing that it's actually possible via the impossibility of the contrary, negating that it is in fact possible for this to happen. So by that reason, you also have to make a presupposition here. And I think one of the main things is that the naturalist will always say, you know, my presupposition is actually less biased than yours. You've heard a lot tonight. Well, this is a conclusion that I've come to. I didn't start with this. Well, it doesn't matter what you started with, right? I didn't start as a theist. Okay, I was an atheist for 25 years. What I'm saying now is, regardless if this is a claimed conclusion you've come to, at this present moment, this is a presupposition that you hold to. Okay, and when I'm saying this, I'm talking specifically about people that hold metaphysical naturalism as a worldview. And the only people that can deny this is like I said, they deny it provisionally and so on and so forth. Now, I want to present to you kind of an analogy here. Most atheists will say, you know, or like Xbox eloquently puts it, you know, I don't believe in God because I've had no reason to rule him in. You know, I don't rule him out, but I have no reason to rule him in. Think about this. What if a Christian said, well, I believe in God because I've just had no reason to rule him out? You know, well, that assumes. It sounds weird because it assumes that the most unbiased footing is the person that claims the naturalistic point of view, right? So that the naturalistic point of view is going to be, they're going to claim that their position is less biased, right? Well, my position is less biased because I can prove it with methodological naturalism. I have evidence here. So, but that only reinforces their bias, right? A person who holds to a presuppositional worldview of metaphysical naturalism is going to always press methodological naturalism as a standard to prove all truth claims, right? So all truth claims that they evaluate through methodological naturalism. And they'll say, no, I actually evaluate them through other ways. Well, sure you might, but is there any truth claim that you've ever accepted that cannot be verified through methodological naturalism? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a truth claim. Now, I want to say one more thing. Ozzy had a really interesting analogy tonight that is a horrible category error. And I think a lot of you guys are going to see this. So he says that, well, when you present to us, you know, you can either believe in God, or you either presuppose God or presuppose not God, right? This is a false dichotomy. Well, then he goes on and he presents a true dichotomy. He presents a quarter in your pocket or not a quarter. So there's a quarter or not a quarter. So he presents a true dichotomy. But that's not what I'm going to bang him for. What I'm going to bang him for is it's a category error. He's presenting something that the quarter can be proven through methodological naturalism. Right? So we have an analogy here that he's so eloquently presented us, that's a category error, because this analogy, the quarter in your pocket, can be proven through methodological naturalism. There's no bias here. No one's going to be biased about whether or not you have a quarter in your pocket. You either do or you don't. Right? It's not a transcendental claim. Okay, so he's made a category error because we're talking about a transcendental claim. This proverbial quarter in your pocket cannot be proven, right? And so that's how I want to address that. But a few more things I wanted to say, and then I know I've taken a lot of time here. The few things that Isaac says, well, there's certain things that I'd be willing to accept as evidence for God, right? And he says, what about God controlling the night stars, or everyone having a simultaneous experience that all confirms itself, right? Well, and he says that he's even heard the skeptics, because he provided a defeater for the skeptics. Some of the skeptics you'll hear say, what if it's aliens doing mind control? And then Ozzy, which is really amazing that he said this, he says these skeptics are dogmatists, right? Because the supernatural explanation recommends itself, right? It's more likely, right? Well, Ozzy has to concede that this is a spectrum here, right? So there's a certain spectrum of events that are, at a certain point, it's going to be more likely for it to be a supernatural explanation, but after a certain edge on the spectrum, it's going to be more natural for it to be a natural explanation, right? So when you provide that spectrum, and that spectrum is judged through subjectivity, right? Your own subjective nature judges this spec. Some people, the diehard skeptic, is going to be the dogmatist to Ozzy here. So that presents another pretty big problem. And the last thing I'm going to say, and this is just another 10-second cap off, is that I think the main problem here with the presuppositional argument is you don't always want to levy it at all atheists. You want to levy it at people that presuppose metaphysical naturalism. How do you know someone presupposes metaphysical naturalism? Have conversations with them. Okay, when they always ask for proof, and they want this proof in forms of methodological naturalism, that's clue number one. Okay, and then you can piece this together through talks with them. But the last thing I'll say is the most unbiased, when they claim that naturalism is more unbiased than supernaturalism, that begs the question, and that's all I'll say for that. Thank you.
Now, I know, Epi, you wanted to jump in on something there as well, just because a lot of this was targeted at Ozzy. I'm going to let Ozzy respond first, and then we're going to move on to Epi and whoever else wants to add something in.
Give me some points to figure out if Ozzy would sum up his stance after you go, Ozzy, and let Jimmy respond to it. He missed that whole first part, but if you have a sum up version.
Boy.
Well,
you want me to be concise?
Yeah, no, why don't you just address the quarter analogy?
Yeah, that quarter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing to say in response to Seamus is I completely agree with you that a lot of people in the great debate, people on the atheistic side, my side, will play hide the ball with what they actually believe about naturalism, and they will cloak their metaphysical naturalism behind an alleged methodological naturalism, and that's just sort of a way of sounding more fallibilistic and more open-minded. And a lot of people, I think, when you press them on this, you ask them, what would it take to convince you of the supernatural or the existence of a God, and no matter what evidence you would adduce, they would always declare, well, that would just be more natural. Those people, I think, are in fact playing hide the ball and exposing themselves as hypocrites when they do that. So I agree with you there. And I have to say, you said at one point that Ozzy was conceding this. I don't concede this. I insist on this. This is not a concession on my part. With respect to the quarter example, the quarter example wasn't meant to be a direct analogy with the God example. It was just to show how the mere fact that there you have an ontological state of affairs that is black and white, either or, P or not P, does not in any way restrict the number of doxastic states, or what are called propositional attitudes, attitudes of belief towards those propositions, to two. Just because there's only two existential and ontological possibilities doesn't restrict the doxastic states to two. That is confusing intentionality and extensionality when people make that mistake. But I mean, if you're troubled by the fact that the quarter example is something that can be sort of empirically verified and established, I mean, consider another hypothetical that I think would avoid that possibility. Consider the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe, right? There is, at any given moment, a certain number of hydrogen atoms in the universe, right? Hydrogen atoms are being created and destroyed all the time. Our sun right now, consists of a whole bunch of hydrogen atoms that are fusing together into helium. So that number of hydrogen atoms in the universe is in constant flux. It's constantly changing, increasing and decreasing. But at any given instant, there is a definite number of hydrogen atoms in the universe, and that number of hydrogen atoms is going to be unbelievably large. But given that there is a definite number of hydrogen atoms in the universe, and by definite I don't mean that we can determine it, it's indeterminate, right? In fact, it's indeterminable. We'll never find out that answer. Well, there's no procedure that we could ever have that will give us the answer to that question. But given that there is a finite and definite number of hydrogen atoms in the universe at any given moment, even though that changes from moment to moment, in any given moment there is such a number, that number is either even or odd. Okay? Well, are you an evenist or are you an oddist with respect to the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe? I don't know about you, but I'm an agnostic on this question. I don't know how to answer that question, and you know, maybe there would be a way to resolve that. I doubt it, but so that would be the same kind of situation. You know, we have to be agnostics about that question of whether the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe at any given moment is either even or odd. Right? We're just not in a position to answer that, so this is something that is not empirically demonstrable. We don't have a verification procedure that would allow us to do this. No one's ever going to be able to count the number of hydrogen atoms. I mean, once you started counting, by the time you went 1, 2, then that number is going to change on you, right? Because the number of hydrogen atoms is changing constantly. So we're never going to have an answer to this question. But nevertheless, it would still be a mistake to say, listen, Seamus, the number of hydrogen atoms right now, when I'm uttering this sentence, is either even or odd. Are you an evenist or an oddist? You have to presuppose one or the other. No, I don't have to presuppose either one of those things. And it can be the same thing for God or any other hypothetical entity or actual entity that you posit. And so whether or not it's something that's empirically verifiable, like, you know, whether there's a quarter in my pocket or not, it has nothing to do with it. That I think is irrelevant. But I think that the hydrogen molecule example, or hydrogen atom is what I should have been saying, hydrogen atom example vitiates that objection, I hope, anyway.
No, I like that. Epi, do you still want to add something into this before?
I have a 1-2 sentence reply to that.
Sure.
I think that that's also, unfortunately, a category error, except for the fact that I don't want to harp on it too much because it's impossible to really present a category error with a true transcendental claim. For example, the reason why this is also the atoms, hydrogen atoms, is also a category error is because they're spatiomatter, they're mass, right? They theoretically could be proven due to methodological naturalism. The only constraint is time and sheer numbers, right? But we're talking theoretical. It theoretically could be proven through methodological naturalism due to the fact that it's mass and spatiomatter, right? But the transcendental claim is actually not something that can be proven regardless of sheer numbers or even theoretically through methodological naturalism. That's, again, still a category error.
I don't see how that's a category error.
Can I just quickly respond, because I did tell Gibbs a bit ago, and there's something I really need to address. Plus, there's another thing Seamus did say I want to address right now. So the reason why this isn't a category error isn't because it is also because methodological naturalism would not say it has the tools to calculate. Like, you can make a good argument by saying we don't have the tools to calculate this. When we do mathematics and do our application of mathematics, we only have a certain time frame to do the calculations before that changes, and of course, we can't really do that. Now here's the thing. When it comes to God, that's also theoretical, pure and simple, as we discussed this, because philosophical arguments about God's existence are taken in theory. You don't go outside and get evidence for God's existence. We provide logical, deductive proofs, more or less. And one thing that I wanted to claim and get to was, I think it's a huge flaw to exegete the notion from Romans 1, if that's what you're specifically getting, that everybody knows about God's existence. Because Paul is talking, since Paul is actually using a specific time frame from the point in creation where a certain group of people give up on God and, of course, go to their own immorality. And, of course, Paul later on in that same verse specifies a group of people who practice homosexuality, as well on top of their denial of God. So those who practice homosexuality, or my friend Jade says it's just prostitution, but that's just. But I think I'll just go with sexual immorality to be general here. Not all non-believers practice a form of sexual immorality. There are, for example, some non-believers who are asexual and don't practice any form of sex to begin with. There are also, for even making it that broad. So I think if we're going to have to specify that all non-believers necessarily know of God's existence, we also have to state that all non-believers are also practicing sexual immorality. Or if we're going with our more traditional Christian interpretation, all non-believers are practicing homosexuality and they just don't know about it. And that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, so just to present, Jimmy holds a very similar stance what Seamus has. Maybe you'll elaborate on it to some different point here. So I'm going to pass it off to him before we get any more responses from Ozzy and Floyd. So Jimmy, feel free to go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. First of all, is this mic clear?
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. There's two mics here, and I could be using the wrong one. Thanks for having me, guys. Let me address the category error because maybe it'll give some insight into the views that I hold with Seamus, and then maybe I can just run over my entire system really quick in maybe 2 minutes or less. So concerning the category error, I think it's a category error to compare Seamus's transcendental categories to the question of whether or not there are hydrogen atoms, because in the sort of equation that you set up, Ozzy, with hydrogen atoms, this is a verifiable fact, but it's not set to be a fact which is a precondition for all other facts. Seamus is making the very strong claim, and I would second it, that the God of the Christian Bible is not a fact to be verified. It's never a fact in question, but rather it is a fact which is a precondition for all other facts. And the very concept of truth, existence, knowledge, even the very concept of concepts are non-starters without this precondition. Just to quickly answer your question, how is it verifiable? It's hypothetically verifiable in the equation you set up. It's conceivable that we could come up with some kind of tool that would allow us to know how many hydrogen atoms. But the problem is that in your thought experiment, the hydrogen atoms are something that are up to the question of our experience. Whereas Seamus is making the strong claim that our experience is not even intelligible without the precondition of God's existence and without the precondition of our awareness of God's existence. So really quickly, to run over my point of view is that God is the absolute, and I mean that very similar to what the idealists meant when they say God is the absolute. It is to say that He has the master plan. He has a foreordaining plan that brings together all the facts of the universe. And so human predication is only true insofar as it comports with the plan that God has of the way that the universe works, of the way that He's predestined the universe to come about. Now, how has God revealed Himself? God has revealed Himself through general revelation, which means that because God is the absolute, because God has the master plan, that is, He is all rational, and every fact in the universe is rationally known and described by Him, we come into existence as beings in His image, thus having the same, or rather a similar rational connection to the universe that God has. And we have an awareness of the absolute, at least enough of an idea so that when we predicate things about the facts of the universe, we are appealing to God's plan as the absolute. So once again, God has revealed Himself through creation because It's only through him that we actually come to predicate things about the universe. And it's only through our original knowledge of him that he's imprinted on us as human beings that we can do so. And so that's sort of my attempt at a less than 2-minute or around that time summary of
All right.
what we're arguing here.
Well, thank you very much for keeping it down, or keeping the time down on that one. Ozzy, do you have a response for that?
Yeah, sure. Although I think, in fairness, Floyd had something to say, and I've had a lot of airtime, so I'd rather yield my time to Floyd right now, and you can come back to me after if you wish.
All right.
Okay, I mean, I just have just a quick comment. I mean, Jimmy, you're declaring those things as necessary, and if that's the case, then it would be necessary. I don't see why presuppositionally you have to either accept that or deny it. I mean, it could be very well the case that your God is the necessary precondition for intelligibility and experience and to comprehend anything at all. That could be a possibility, but I don't see why you have to either presuppose that or not presuppose it.
Jimmy?
Can I? Okay, thank you. Yeah, the issue is that when you claim that something is a transcendental category, and this is true of any object, I could claim that even a hydrogen atom is a transcendental category, and all that means is, well, then the concept of a hydrogen atom is preconditional to all other facts in the universe. That's all that means. The problem is that when somebody claims this, I'll use Allah as an example. A Muslim might claim that Allah is a transcendental category. That is, he is a necessary presupposition for our experience to be intelligible. That means that as soon as you say, well, I don't believe in Allah, you're contradicting the position in question. You're contradicting the Muslim, because the Muslim is saying we have to be aware of Allah because it's only in light of our awareness of Allah that we can make sense of our experience. So this is why agnosticism is actually self-defeating from the outset, because to hold that one is not contradicting or negating the transcendental categories in question, let's say the Christian God, and then to simultaneously hold that one does not believe in those transcendental categories are two propositions which oppose each other, and that is the definition of a contradiction. And since that's the definition of agnosticism, or at least soft agnosticism, that view is precluded from the outset.
Yeah, but the agnostic is not denying that Allah or any transcendental being is the precondition of that. He's simply claiming that he simply doesn't know. It could be very much the case that it is a necessary precondition, but the agnostic is not denying it. He's saying that, yes, that could be very well possible. I simply don't know it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I would like to add in there, Jamie. Or my picture kind of says what it is. From not a presupposition, those are conclusions I come to. I start out with some presuppositions, but I move along those evidence lines to those positions. You're arguing from one of those presuppositions back at me, saying that it's all-encompassing, but I'm coming from a place that's not all-encompassing because I don't know.
If I just might add something to this, I think we're nitpicking whether or not this is analogous, considering that God is transcendental, whereas through methodological naturalism we come to a notion of whether or not stars are even or odd in number. Well, we could actually change this to fit a transcendental claim and make the same point. So, for example, are there an even number of true propositions or an odd number of true propositions? And of course, since a few people in here are Platonists, or we could even pose this question to a Platonist, or certain Platonists who think that propositions and abstract concepts are transcendental, then I think the analogy is pretty fit. Is there an even number of true propositions or an odd number of true propositions?
But I think it's not about the knowledge of it. That's, I think, what Ozzy was going into.
I
Is it
know.
okay if I,
I know. I just had that idea and I wanted to throw it out there in case we wanted a more robust example.
You
Yeah,
can't break free of the fallacious reasoning of metaphysical naturalism by just saying that it's provisionally. It's when you assert that it's provisional, it's just an assertion, and when everything lines up with the fact that it's not an assertion, that it's actually consistent with that worldview, I think by putting forth by saying it's possible for the contrary to exist is actually a contradiction in itself. The agnostic claim is still a contradictory.
Can I hear what are the two propositions that are alleged to be contradictory here? I'm not entirely clear. I think you and Jimmy might be disagreeing, or you may be stating it
So if you
differently.
say
But it seems
that,
to what's the contradiction exactly?
well,
Which
there's a
two
couple.
propositions?
One of which would be that the Christian God is a necessary precondition for all existence, that due to the impossibility of the contrary. When you be agnostic and you say, I'm sitting on the fence that it's possible that that's true, but it's also possible that life could have come from some other way. That agnosticism, that fence sitting, contradicts what I'm saying because it negates the impossibility to the contrary. When I'm saying this is true.
Wait. What? I just need to know what the two. Sorry to interrupt you, but what are the two propositions? What are the P and the not P? Could you just state what the proposition is and what its negation is?
The proposition is all of existence is contingent on the Christian God.
And you're thinking the agnostic is asserting it is not the case?
Yeah, we're asserting that it's possible due to the impossibility of the contrary. So if you say that I'm sitting on the fence, that it's possible for it to be this way, but it's also possible for it to not be this way. You saying it's possible for it to not be this way through your agnosticism is actually saying it's possible for it to not to be impossibility of the contrary, which is, like Jimmy said, it's self-defeating. The provisional claim, the
That's
proverbial...
not self-defeating. That's just that would be merely denying your assertion. That's not
yes, you're
self-defeating.
contradicting my assertion. Yes,
but that's not self-contradictory. It's self-contradictory when I contradict my own position, not when I contradict your position. So it's not self-defeating, and it's not a contradiction. It's you and I enter into a contradiction every time we disagree on anything.
That's not what I was saying, though. I'm saying when you contradict my claim, specifically through the impossibility of the contrary, you cannot claim to sit on the fence.
Yes, I can.
No, you've contradicted my claim.
No, because you could persuade me. You could persuade me.
Well, you're saying I could persuade you, but like I said, that's an assertion that is still just proverbial fence-sitting because you realize the fallaciousness of presupposing the worldview of metaphysical naturalism.
Well, now you're presupposing that my position can't be sincere.
Well, what I'm actually saying is it's more rational and consistent to believe through this discourse that what you're putting forth now is actually an assertion because you can't provide to me an all-defeater. For example, if you were able to provide to me something that you believe in that is immaterial, that's not a concept or an abstraction, that would be an all-defeater. If you could provide to me an example of something that you hold to, a truth claim that you hold to that is not verifiable through methodological naturalism, that would be a defeater. But
I wouldn't do methodological naturalism if I could do that. If I could, I mean, what you're saying is if you could assert some claim about the supernatural that you sincerely believe to be true, then you'd be sincere. But no, then I would cease to be a provisional naturalist or a metaphysical naturalist,
exactly.
Or a methodological naturalist, right? Which is to say that your requirement, your sincerity condition on me is that I be contradicting myself. That's what you're requiring of me. I'm not required to meet that standard.
It's a claim because you can't provide to me an all-defeater. If you can't provide to me any evidence you've ever accepted that's not verifiable.
I gave you some, actually. I actually gave you, I started this by giving you an example of
hypothetical. I'm asking you to give
me
an example.
Well, what else could it be?
No.
Well, if I give you an example, I wouldn't be any kind of naturalist.
But I'm saying...
Can I interject? Can I interject here real quick? Because I think Ozzy that the propositions are really simple. When someone holds that transcendental categories may exist, but they hold that they are not relied upon knowingly. These are the two contradicting propositions. So it's the same as to say God, a being who cannot exist unbeknownst to people, may exist unbeknownst to people. That is the contradiction of soft agnosticism. Because again, the strong claim that me and Seamus is making is that nothing can exist apart from God as the existence is preconditioned, and nothing can be said to be known about existence apart from first knowing God as the person who has the plan that defines the very thing that's the very object that's being claimed to being known. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but it's not a self-contradiction. It's a contradiction between my position and your position, or your position and the person that you're arguing with. Of course, those two positions are in contradiction. That's why you're having the argument. But it's not a self-contradiction on the part of the other person. I'm not at odds with myself.
So,
if I'm an agnostic, or even if I'm an atheist.
That's exactly what started that, was the convo, was that from your point of view, Jimmy, yes, you're saying this is what's happening. From my point of view, that's completely different. It's exactly what Ozzy's saying.
Could I elaborate on this a little bit? Because Jimmy, I don't know if you heard me at the beginning of this. I don't know at what point you started watching, and I know when you joined, but I don't know that I had said this subsequent to your joining, so you might have missed this. But I was talking a little bit about modal logic, and I mean, this is a sort of a mistake that people make here. If you say that necessarily P, if you say that it's necessarily the case that P, okay, then it follows, just on the principles of modal logic, that possibly P, right? It means that if P is necessary, then P is minimally, at least, possible. Why? Because to say that something is necessary is to say that it's an actualized possibility at every possible world, right? Just like in a truth table, right? So one can speak of things which are necessary and speak of them under the description of mere possibility, right? You can speak of things that are necessary under the description of possibility, right? Now, if God exists necessarily, then it's also possible that he exists. It's minimally possible that God exists if he exists necessarily, because necessarily implies possibility, but possibility does not imply necessity, right? So it's possible that therefore it's possible that he exists necessarily, right? Because if you say necessarily P, right, you can also derive possibly necessarily P. And so one can, without begging the question of God's allegedly necessary existence, speak of this being as possible. To say God is possible is not to deny that God is merely a possibility, right? That is a non-necessity, right? And this is just basic modal logic, right? So I think that this is what might be going on here. When you hear people say, I think it's possible that God exists, and you're talking about a necessary being, you're thinking that the person is asserting that God is merely a possibility. He exists only in some possible worlds, not in all possible worlds. But to say that God is a possible being is to say that he exists at least one possible world, and he may exist at all possible worlds. Right?
So
that's what it means. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could jump in here real quick and just sum this up. Part of the issue is that we're not making the more humble claim that God is merely necessary in terms of modality. We're making the claim that God is transcendentally necessary. And what that means is God's existence is a precondition for all the other facts in existence. So, in fact, God's existence is a precondition for the very predication, or the very concept of human predication. But irregardless, this is the point where I believe it is contradictory, and I mean by that self-defeating, because soft agnosticism is holding that it's neutral with respect to the Christian position. However, the issue is that by definition, holding that you are neutral with respect to a transcendental category is logically identical to contradicting that logical category. So soft agnosticism has to both hold to the proposition that it's neutral and that it's not neutral, namely because it's contradicting certain categories, like, for example, the Christian God. And so, again, it's not a matter of merely contradicting my position, which I grant you, Ozzy, but it's a matter of saying soft agnosticism is not even a coherent position in the first place, because you actually, by necessity, have to accept or reject my position from the outset, just like you have to accept or reject any given transcendental category at the outset.
Okay, I would disagree with two things there to disagree with. The second one, the last one you said was, or maybe it was the first now, I'm confused about the order, was that the agnostic has to assert both of these things. The agnostic is not asserting both of these things. What the agnostic is doing is precisely not asserting either of them. And nobody is required to assert either of them, just because there's only two possibilities: either God is necessary or God is not necessary, right? We have oh, hello, why can't I think of the expression? Forgive me, I'm tired. An excluded middle, that's the expression I'm looking for. We have an excluded middle here, right? Either God exists necessarily or he does not exist necessarily, right? But the agnostic is not asserting one or asserting its contrary. The agnostic is, by definition, asserting neither. And that is, in fact, a doxastic state. That is a propositional attitude that you can hold to two propositions, which is withholding assent to either. Just because I withhold assent to one does not mean I assent to the other. That is a fallacy to say that if you withhold assent to one, you are asserting or assenting to the other proposition, the negation. That is simply not true. I mean, I can give examples, other examples that have not to do with true and false and contradictions with respect to intentionality and extensionality if people would like, but that might take us far afield. But there is a fallacy going on here. And then, I'm sorry, I forgot my second point, but maybe I'll stop there. Jimmy, in the chat, in the side chat, says, Ozzy, perhaps we're using different understandings of soft agnosticism. Well, all I mean by agnosticism is there are really commonly two forms of agnosticism. There's the Huxleyan agnostic, which is the person who asserts that nobody is and ever will be in a position to have sufficient warrant to assent to the proposition God exists or to the proposition God does not exist. Right? So the idea is that not only does this person not know, but it is unknowable. Right? That's Huxleyan agnosticism. And then there's a sort of the more common softer agnosticism, which is where a person simply says, I don't know if it's unknowable, but I know that I don't know it. I'm not in a position, given the present state of the evidence in my possession, to assent to the proposition God exists, nor do I have the evidence sufficient to rationally assent to the proposition God does not exist. That's what I mean by agnosticism or soft agnosticism is a person who, at least for themselves, says, I'm not in a position to assent to either proposition.
Exactly.
So I don't.
Exactly. That was perfect. That's exactly my stance. That is perfect.
Yeah. Jimmy, do you have a different conception of this, just so we don't equivocate?
No, that's actually precisely the concept that I'm using. I would define the soft version of agnosticism as an intellectual doctrine or attitude affirming the uncertainty of claims made with respect to certain deities.
Yeah, the proposition. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I stand by my critique of that because, again, when you claim to be uncertain of when you claim not to know, believe in, rely on, so on and so forth, the transcendental categories in question, in this case the Christian God, that is by definition itself a negation of those categories, because to be a category is to be something which is a precondition for the very doxastic judgment that's being made on the part of the agnostic.
Only from your presupposition, though, right? It's only from your presupposition that you make that claim.
No, I would say that that's the nature of transcendental argumentation, and to reject that, I think, is to reject certain rules of inference.
Yeah, I would agree with Jimmy here. I mean, in a transcendental argument, what you're doing is you're arguing by reductio ad absurdum. You're positing some claim, some proposition. Then you assume arguendo, that is, for the sake of argument, the negation of that proposition. And if within the scope of the assumption that that proposition is false, you can derive a contradiction, you've established the impossibility of the contrary of the original proposition. So if you assume P, if you think P is true, and then you proceed by assuming not P, and within the scope of assuming not P, you derive a contradiction, you've just shown that not P is true, not P is necessarily false, and therefore P is true. And so that's proof by contradiction, or reductio ad absurdum. And transcendental arguments are supposed to have in their logical structure that kind of reductio ad absurdum. Am I being fair to your position, Jimmy?
Isn't that still from your presupposition, like what you just said? That still, you presuppose the P. From that stance, you make the claim, and you come to where they're.
Well, no, because what you do in a transcendental argument is you actually you believe P, let's say, but then you just say, well, forget that, bracket that, let's put that aside, let's assume not P, let's assume let's assume that my presupposition is false. Okay, let's assume that God doesn't exist. If in the scope of that assumption, I can show some incoherence or internal inconsistency, right? If I can actually derive a contradiction within the scope of that assumption, then I've shown that the proposition that there's no God has to be false. And then there's
contrary, right?
What's that?
That would be you trying to go through the impossibility of the contrary, right?
Right. That's trying to establish the impossibility of the contrary. Yeah, that's what it is to establish the impossibility of the contrary. Is to actually, you have to actually produce some kind of reductio. And this, I think, is actually a shortcoming with presuppositionalism. Is I actually never have read or heard the actual reductio. There are various other moves that they make, but never an actual proof of the impossibility of the contrary.
Right.
A lot of assertion that their position has to be correct based on the impossibility of the contrary. But establishing the impossibility of the contrary, it's actually really, really hard. I mean, you've got to produce a reductio ad absurdum, and that's rather hard.
Can I clarify one thing?
Yeah, please,
Sure.
please.
And then I promise I'll get off the mic because I don't want to be a mic hog. Seamus actually communicated this shockingly well. Even I have not communicated this as well, but the terms that he put this in, and I think that this again brings about the very self-defeating nature of soft agnosticism. Remember, I don't have a problem with hard agnosticism or other Gnostic versions of an atheistic or anti-theistic point of view. But anyways, just to do with soft agnosticism, he said that by virtue of the fact that one is not accepting the possibility of the contrary, that is, because one is accepting the possibility that the possibility of the contrary is not the case, that necessitates that it's not the case, because the impossibility of the contrary cannot be possibly untrue or negated if true. And so from that standpoint, or from that perspective, the same exclusive propositions found within the definition of agnosticism can be communicated that way.
Could I press my example about the hydrogen atoms here? I mean, there's an element in the no pun intended. There's an element in the example of the hydrogen atom that I had sort of left out, that I didn't mention, that I think actually speaks to this. I mean, if I say, listen, the number of hydrogen atoms in any given instant is a finite number, and that number is either even or odd, that is a matter of necessity, is it not? That is a matter of absolutely logical necessity, right? Well, one could argue, especially if you're a Platonist, that it's a matter of metaphysical and transcendental necessity, right? So here this dovetails nicely with Epicurus's example about the number of true propositions being even or odd, right? So, I mean, the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe is, in any given instance, is either be necessarily even or necessarily odd. Right? Now, if someone comes along who's an evenist and says, look, it's necessarily even, and I come along and I go, well, I don't know, maybe it's necessarily even, or maybe it's necessarily odd. Whatever it is, I don't know which it is, but it's necessarily even or odd. That's for sure. I'll grant you that. But maybe the number of hydrogen atoms necessarily is always even, or maybe it's always necessarily an odd number. I can't think of why it has to be necessarily even or odd, but it doesn't matter. It's certainly necessarily one or the other. But if you want to insist that it's necessarily even or necessarily odd, you're going to have to produce an argument, and it's the same. And I see this as analogous with God. If you want to say that God exists necessarily, you need to produce an argument that shows that God exists necessarily. And if I, not even having heard the argument, say, well, wait a minute, I'm not persuaded, I am not denying that God exists necessarily. I'm saying I am unpersuaded that God exists necessarily. And it's just as I would say I'm not persuaded that the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe must necessarily be an even number. I am not therefore saying that the number of hydrogen atoms is odd. That would be a fallacy to assert that I was assenting to the opposite proposition. And I think it's exactly the same with your argument with God.
Can I steal that analogy from you real quick, Ozzy? Is that okay?
I don't claim to have any copyright on it, so I probably didn't come up with it myself anyway.
There we go. At least I don't have to break copyright laws. So I would say that the analogy better fits this way. Someone comes up to you, Ozzy, and says, "Hey, look, the concept of a hydrogen atom is actually the absolute. In other words, it has the function of rationalizing all facts in the universe. All facts in the universe are what they are relative to the determination of the hydrogen atom, and therefore it is impossible to exist or to know things or to believe things or to predicate anything without respect to this hydrogen atom, without depending on objectively, that is relying on its existence, and without depending on subjectively, that is relying on the knowledge of its existence in order to do so." So in that analogy, if this person approached me and I said, well, I don't take a stance on the hydrogen atom. I invoke my right to withhold a proclamation with respect to the existence of the hydrogen atom. The issue then is that because this person is saying that the hydrogen atom is actually a precondition for my ability to even say this, I'm actually contradicting his position by necessity. That's a necessary implication of what I'm saying.
Right, you're contradicting his position, not your own.
Right, but see, right, so that's the problem is I am holding simultaneously to the fact that I'm not going to make any judgments on this. I'm invoking my right to withhold judgment. But by that very notion, I have made judgment that his view is false because
you haven't. No, that's precisely what agnostic has not done. Is said that the view is false.
Yeah. See, from my point of view, because this is the point of view that I do hold, is that the possibility that God exists does not give me sufficient reason to believe in his existence or even his inexistence. I don't really know where else to go from there. It's not like I'm holding both of those views. It's just that I don't have any, like I said, I don't have the reason to believe in either.
There's a point here, though, that Jimmy is articulating that we might not be getting, though. He's not just talking about the existence of God, but that God is necessary for all belief, all knowledge, all predication. And what we mean by predication is when you say that this is true of that. If I say that the egg is white and the yolk is yellow, right? Or the man is tall, I'm predicating yellow of the yolk and white of the egg and tallness of the man. To predicate is merely just to say of one say something of another thing, right? Is to attribute something to another thing. That's predication, right? And so what Jimmy is saying here is that if I read correctly, that all belief, all thought about objects, all talk of evidence, all talk of knowledge, all talk about anything, just describing something, the act of predication presupposes and requires and necessitates this God. Now, when I hear this claim, I'm unpersuaded by it because I haven't heard a compelling argument to think that it's the case. But I'm not saying, therefore, that it can't be the case and that it isn't the case. I'm withholding assent. I'm not convinced, right? Now, as a matter of fact, I think it is false because I'm not an agnostic. I think in this case, I think that claim is completely unwarranted, and I think it is false. But you know, an agnostic can say, I'm not persuaded by that this is the case. And if you say, well, yeah, so are you convinced of the other alternative? He goes, well, no, I'm not convinced of the alternative either. It's exactly like I'm not convinced that the number of atoms, hydrogen atoms in the universe is necessarily an even number or necessarily an odd number. It could be one or the other, and whichever it is, it might be necessarily even or odd, but I'm not in a position to tell. And so, Jimmy, whenever you say that it's self-defeating or a contradiction, the only contradiction you pointed to is that they are denying your claim. Well, sure, they're denying your claim, but not in the sense that they are asserting the opposite of your claim, but that they are simply not prepared to assent to your claim. But the fact that I'm not prepared to assent to your claim is not the same thing as saying that your claim is false.
Exactly. You're representing the point very well.
Okay, I just want to make sure that the point I made about predication was correct. Jimmy, is that what you were talking about?
Yes, that's a very fair definition of predication, yes.
Yeah, imagine you're walking down the street and someone comes up to you and says, oh, I have a transcendental truth that you have to accept or deny, you know, transcendental truth A, and then the next person walks up to you and says, oh, I have transcendental truth B, and then the next person comes to you and says, I have transcendental truth C, and so forth. It's like, you know, do I have to add all these presuppositions onto my worldview now because someone came up to me and introduced me to a new possible transcendental truth?
Well, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
In a sense, yes, actually. I have no problem with saying, and by the way, there are countless religious positions which would take up a transcendental form of argumentation. But yeah, Floyd, in a way, I would say, yeah, from the outset, I presuppose the falsity of your view, because in presupposing the Christian God Yahweh, who in his revelation has contradicted all non-Christian views, so by definition, I have presupposed the falsity of all non-Christian views from the very outset. And I would be happy to admit that and happy to grant that to people making transcendental arguments.
Yeah, that's what I would.
Yeah, but say I'm being bombarded by the claim you just made from all these different people. 100 people come up to me with the same claim you have, but they, instead of crossing out, you know, instead of Yahweh, you have Allah or Vishnu or, you know, it doesn't matter, A, B, C, and D. You know, you're saying, okay, the presuppositions of my worldview are increasing based on other people's presuppositions and worldviews. And
no, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, so I apologize if that's what it looked like I was communicating. No, I'm not saying there's added propositional content to your presupposition. I'm saying because you have presuppositions which already rule out these other presuppositions from the outset.
Well, I don't. That's the problem. I don't.
But see, okay, and that's exactly the contradiction I'm trying to point out, which is, by definition of what a transcendental category is, it must, I mean, that is simply the nature of a transcendental category. It must be relied upon or be negated from the outset. There is no other way around the issue.
Again, I don't know if I have to rely on it or not. I don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
You don't.
That's exactly what I was asking earlier when I was asking if you're from your presupposition, that's where you're making that transcendental argument from. You're yelling it back to someone that hasn't decided which path to take.
Right, and I think that your position is sincere, Xbox, and the same of Ozzy and Floyd. But the problem is that, again, with respect to transcendental categories, and I happily accept what Floyd said. This argument has been used by countless positions, and I think will be used by countless more positions in the future. But I think, again, it's simply impossible to say, I don't know whether or not this transcendental category exists, because in saying that, the logical implication is that one does not know this, that this logical category exists. But if the transcendental category existed, it would necessitate knowledge of its existence. So by virtue of the fact that you're saying, I don't rely on this, or excuse me, I don't believe that I rely on this, I don't believe in its existence.
I don't know. Yeah, I could be relying on it. Or it could be necessary that I have to rely on it, but I just don't know.
Right. Exactly.
So at this point in time, we are kind of approaching the end of the scheduled broadcast that we had here. I'm going to open it up now just to let people make any type of closing statements they want to make. I encourage you guys to keep it brief. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the link public and go off air, and anything that anybody that's watching wants to jump in and throw in are more than welcome to at that point in time. So I'm going to start off on my screen here, right to left here. So at Xbox, and then we'll move down the line from there.
Yeah. I think all the points were covered. I think Jimmy understands mostly where we're coming from, but then when he goes into it, it's about saying that we believe the negation of it, kind of thing, which, like Floyd was saying, we could be relying on it. This could be the case. I have no way of knowing if that's the case. That's the problem I sit with. And Seamus said it for me earlier. I always say I don't have to rule God out of things. I just don't have a reason to rule him into the equation. Short of that, I'm stuck. So thank you.
All right, Shanna. Okay. Ozzy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me right now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so that's funny. My control panel says I'm muted, but okay. I'd like to say a little something about intentionality and extensionality, because I mentioned this before, and it's a difficult concept, but it goes to the heart of this, because this is an argument that I'm hearing from Jimmy and Seamus here, that I also hear from atheists. Atheists will often say, look, either there's a God or there's no God, therefore you're an atheist, or you're a theist. There's no middle ground. There's no room for agnosticism. Agnostics are just, a kind of atheist, and they don't realize it. Okay. Now, let me sort of explain why I think this is wrong. If there are certain predicates, certain expressions that we use that are called extensional. Okay. I'll give you an example. Consider the predicate looking at, to look at something. If I say John is looking at the morning star, okay, and the morning star is Venus, which it is, we would say, therefore, John is looking at Venus. And that would be a logical argument. John is looking at the morning star is Venus, therefore, John is looking at Venus, because to look at the morning star is to look at Venus, right? That follows, that goes through. That argument is perfectly valid, okay? It's perfectly correct. But now consider another proposition, another predicate, the predicate believing that, to believe that. Contrast what I just said, that little syllogism I gave, with this one. John believes that is the morning star. So he's looking up at the sky, and he says, and I say, John believes that is the morning star. Okay? The morning star is Venus, second premise. Therefore, John believes that is Venus. Does that follow? No. It does not follow that if John believes that up in the sky is the morning star, and the morning star is Venus, that John also believes that what he's looking at is Venus. In fact, I have known people who were looking at the morning star and didn't realize that the morning star was Venus, didn't realize that the Venus is the evening star as well. It is a non sequitur when it comes to certain predicates, like believes that, knows that, thinks that, hopes that, opines that, wishes that you can just make these inferences. Okay. Now, there's a lot of technical vocabulary that goes on behind this, but the idea is that belief, the idea of belief and knowledge and anything having to do with intentional states, certain kinds of mental states, are what's known in linguistics and philosophy of language and logic as intentional contexts. Intentional with an S, intentional. Okay? And the distinction between extensional contexts and intentional belief states, okay, is such that you can have more attitudes that you can hold toward a proposition than there are truth conditions. Okay, the truth conditions about God's existence are simple. It's true or false. It's T or F. It's 0, 1. It's binary. Okay, but the fact that there are only two physical or metaphysical or transcendental possibilities with respect to God's existence, that X is the case or X is not the case, does not imply that there are only two possible states of belief about those two possibilities. Okay, the number of doxastic states or possible states of belief it extends beyond the number of metaphysical possibilities. And so if God exists, he could be a contingent being, or he might be a necessary being, right? Or he might not exist at all, right? But if God exists and exists necessarily, it doesn't follow that if God exists necessarily, and necessarily one can only know and believe and exercise predication if God exists necessarily, it doesn't follow that therefore you have to assent to that proposition, and that if you don't assent to that proposition, you are asserting the negation of that proposition. That simply does not follow. And that's just part of the nature of intentional contexts.
All right. Thank you very much, Ozzy. Negation of P.
You're going to have me follow that, huh? No, actually, I don't have much to add to that at all. I mean, I think I've made it fairly clear. I'm pretty much in the same boat as Ozzy. I do believe that there can be, as he stated, more states than just the dichotomous in any proposition. So I'll let it go there. Donate my time to whoever wants to expand on that.
Okay. Jimmy?
Yeah, sure. First, since we're ending here, I'll just preface this with saying thank you all for having me. I guess my point still remains that the propositions, I am not making a true or false claim concerning Christianity. In other words, I'm not making a doxastic judgment with respect to the truth of Christianity. And the proposition, I do not know that the God of Christianity exists, or I do not know that I'm relying on him. The implicit logical implication of which is that Christianity is false, because that's exactly what Christianity claims is the case. And so, moving on, the two propositions, I do not make a doxastic judgment concerning Christianity, but I make a doxastic judgment concerning Christianity, namely that it's false because I don't exist in the state that it says I exist in, are contradictory propositions, and therefore that soft agnosticism, at least, is sort of unfortunately ruled out from the outset. It's like the kid who doesn't get to play on the playground at all. But with respect to the other points of views, the countless points of views, let me just say this as my last comment. I would love to have any conversations about what we actually believe, because it sounds like Ozzy, for example, is not a soft agnostic. For someone who's not a soft agnostic, I'd be happy to maybe have a conversation about internal critique, what Ozzy has correctly called reductio ad absurdum. Some other time, if that's if anyone is available.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that.
All right. Thank you, Jimmy. Floyd?
Yeah, I thought it was a great discussion. A lot of the goals I wanted to accomplish during the discussion, I think, were met. It sounds like, I kind of brought this before, it sounds like we have a new ontological argument here. If we define God as something that is indisputable, then necessarily must exist, because for him to be undisputable, he must necessarily exist. So kind of, or even say define God as something that that is known to all. So this God must necessarily exist for it to be known. It's kind of like a new ontological argument that was formed here. So it's something to think about, I guess.
All right, and Epi.
I don't really think it's a new ontological argument. More along the lines of it strikes me as something that's necessarily doxastic, or making a claim that's necessarily doxastic. So it wouldn't technically be an argument for the existence of God, but basically just but maybe just an argument for one of the properties of God. But I guess my criticism of this argument doesn't really more or less go alongside with the ontology or even the coherence of such an argument, but whether or not such an argument is even made in the Bible or in Christian literature to begin with, or at least relevant Christian literature. I'm not to say that apologetics or presuppositional apologetics isn't relevant Christian literature, but it's just not germane to the doctrinal forming sets of scriptures. But in any case, I think I made my point here.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody that came out for this discussion. All the people that are still left in the hangout now, and Seamus, who had to leave early, as well as Skylar, who was having connection problems there. I want to thank everybody that was watching this, and we'll be back next week with another fun, exciting topic. So thank you guys very much, and I'll see you guys later.